Welcome to the Impact Multiplier CEO podcast. If you're a chief executive, or if you think like one, and you want to create exponentially greater impact, then this show is for you. My name is Richard Medcalf, founder of X Quadrant. I coach some of the most successful and impressive CEOs and executive teams on the planet and help them achieve extraordinary results. And no matter how successful you've been in the past, there's always a whole new level of impact available to you. So if you're ready to play a bigger game than ever before, I invite you to join us and become an Impact Multiplier CEO.
Hi, Richard.
Hi again, Stephanie. It's been many minutes since we last did this.
Yes, I think we can spot on, depending on our outfit changes, how long it's been.
Yeah, of course. If you're listening to this on audio, you don't get to see the beautiful Stephanie and her Parisian fashion sense, which every episode is a new haute couture experiment from the very elite of Paris fashion designers.
Yeah, your standards are so off base. You are wearing a blue shirt, so I guess it's
yeah,
edge really. So maybe that's the difference. Your suburbs, my inner city life.
Yeah, well, given how hot it is today, if you're lucky, I'm not wearing a string vest, right? It's absolutely sweltering, and it's what we're recording. It's just mid-afternoon, so it's really as hot as it's going to be, probably. So
Yeah.
The sacrifices we make for our 10.5 million listener base. So excellent.
All right, so I think we're on to our next. Well, I know we're on to our next topic, which is all around accelerate learning. So tell me some more about what that's about. Maybe start with your Queen quote, and then.
My Queen quote. Yes. My Queen quote. Yeah, as you know, there's a Queen quote for everything, and this is, I guess I'm learning. I must be warmer now, right? This is. I won't do the whole thing. I'll soon be turning around the corner now. Outside the dawn is breaking, but inside in the dark, I'm aching to be free. Which is from The Show Must Go On. And it's just an excuse to get a bit of a Queen quote in, to be honest, around learning, right? I guess I'm learning, because learning is key, right? I mean, we live in a fast-changing world. Everyone knows that. We get hit by more stuff than ever. I mean, this year, 2020, we've seen that so much. And so the questions become, well, it's not so much about performance, it's about adaptation. It's about learning. Are we learning faster than our market? Are we learning faster than our competitors? Are we transmitting learning across our organization so that when we actually learn, we can actually act on it? Are we learning about how to even just to manage teams and spread that learning across the organization? So when we're in a CEO role or we have a large organization, for us to be learning personally is one thing, but how do we actually spread that learning and create a common way of understanding and interpreting everything that's going on around us and the dynamics in our organization and everything else? Because if we don't have that ability, it's extremely hard to make strategic changes, launch new initiatives, focus resources, stop doing some things, start doing other things, because there isn't the awareness and the context. So that's the topic for the day.
Oh, fabulous. It's a subject close to my heart. Having experienced the difference between startup culture and corporate culture, the common theme really is adaptation to change. I mean, any company that you work in, and different organizations have different levers that they can pull on and different ways to flex. So yeah, I'm all for this accelerate learning topic, that's for sure.
And it applies to us at every level, right? It applies to us as individuals, how we keep our skills current, as well as to organizations, right? How do organizations keep their skills current in this world and stay relevant? So I guess I got 4 points. I think 2 of them are more around insights around learning, and the other one are kind of 2 practical kind of actions to take. So I think the first one, let's start on the insights. The first one is, words create our world. Okay, words create our world. So I'll give you an example. Stephanie, if you think about your bank account, Um,
Don't really want to think about my bank account at the moment.
there is a number, right, in that bank account, right? There is just a number, right, on the feet somewhere. On some computer, there is a number.
Sadly.
And, well, right. But it's just a number. But you could look at that number and go, like, wow, I'm so blessed. There's so much abundance. This is more than enough. This is great. It's incredible. Fantastic number, right? You could really look at that number and be really pleased and satisfied. Or you could look at exactly the same number and go, I can't believe it's not 10 times higher at this stage in my life. What a loser I am, blah, blah, blah. I'm pretty much on the edge of precarity, this is, everything's a nightmare, right? You could have those two different views about the same number. And it doesn't actually matter what the number is, right? You could have billionaires or multimillionaires who look at their number and are worried about their future. And you could have people who have a lot less and look at the number and are really satisfied, right? So the words we use kind of structure how we think about the number. There's a quote by somebody, if you think you can or if you think you can't, in both cases, you're right.
Yes, I like that quote. I really like that quote. It's true.
Yeah, and it's true.
It's true. It's true.
And so one thing I do in my coaching is I'm often listening out for the words that my clients create their world with. Just the particular word that you use in a certain moment, you go, why did they choose that word in this moment? What's that showing about how they think about the world? So a classic, people will say things like, I just don't have quality people. That's a really interesting phrase, quality people. I mean, you don't need to go into that particular phrase, but you can imagine unpacking what are the assumptions behind the idea of quality people, right? So you're going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask, when you say words create our world, do you mean the language we use in terms of how we express ourselves or how we think creates our own world, or influences how the world around us sort of interacts with us as well?
I think it does both. I think, first of all, it's the filter that we look at our world through. Okay, so a classic example, it's like an old married couple or young married couple for that matter, just even a life cycle of a relationship, right? You start off and you see certain, you look at certain things about that person, you don't notice other things, right? And then later on you notice other things, and you might just start to focus on negative things that annoy you about that person, right? You could just but our words create our world. So actually, when you you can roll over in bed in the morning and look at your partner and go, oh, they're looking a bit grim or a bit old, a bit, whatever it is. And that's kind of how you're going to, you're literally creating that person now in your mind. Whereas if you roll over and go, oh, this is the love of my life, suddenly you have a different experience of that same person. Right, the person hasn't changed, but you're focusing in on something else, and so I think the words we use reinforce what we see. Okay, so have you ever had that example where you learn a new word, and then literally like the next day somebody uses that word, and you're like, oh, I just learned that word yesterday.
That's a known neurological phenomenon. It's like when you start researching cars, and then suddenly you see the car.
There you go.
You pay attention to the things that you've just learnt about, or
exactly. And so the words that we use describe the contours of what we detect. There is a certain culture, right? They have different words for light blue and for dark blue. I can't remember which culture it is, and they literally see those colors as different colors because they have different words for them. They don't see them as shades of the same color. For them, they're different.
Yes.
And light is a spectrum, right? Light is a spectrum. So we've kind of artificially divided up that rainbow into certain chunks so that we kind of say that's all basically yellow, that's all basically blue. We could have put different boundaries on that. So the words literally cut up our world and divided up in different ways, and it directs our attention.
Yeah, and I can take the analogy a little bit further in that although you and I might use the same word for blue, there's no guarantee that we're seeing the same thing. And so sometimes you have to be careful about the words we use may mean different things to each of us.
Right. So words need definition. But when we start, so right now, so we're moving on. So let's move on. So I think just the first insight is that words create our world. Okay, and listen in for the words that we use, because that reveals the grid that we're seeing, reveals what we're actually looking at, and there are other things that we're not seeing. Again, and just another one is the example of a low performer. This person is a low performer. Well, hang on. They're a senior executive. They're not just a low performer. They've risen through the ranks.
Yeah.
And now, right now, in this season, they're not delivering in some way. But like, to actually put the label low performer on them, there's probably something else going on there. But if you do that, once you've got that label on, that is how you're going to see that person. They are a low performer. Yeah. You could put a different label on that person, right? You could put that label on, high performer being massively undermined by some stupid behavior right now. I mean, I'm making it up, but the words that we use will define the learning and the insights that we see. So let's move on to the next part, which is the second point, which is why I wanted to go from what you just said around that social dimension. Are we using the same definition of the words? And so the second insight, so on the personal level, worlds create our world. It also applies corporately. And so language creates culture. Yeah. And now this is a game changer, because culture eats strategy for lunch, as everybody knows. Culture is what happens when you're not looking, I like to say. Right? When nobody's looking, culture is what you do. Culture is normally what has been proven to succeed, has been proven to work in a certain context. Have a client who has quite a siloed regional organization. The regions don't really trust each other. And I think it's just because in previous years, they found out that if they tried to do things across countries, it never quite worked, and it's better to do it ourselves. So you create a culture, it's better just to do it ourselves. It's not because people are being jerks, it's just because they've learned that's the way to make things happen in this context.
And there's also the learning how to deal with different cultures, which is a whole topic in of itself. And there's I'm just going to digress a bit, but there's the sort of classic story about French team and an English team, and the English team found the French team awfully aggressive and always very demanding and always pushy. And it turned out that the reason they thought this is because the French team was always saying, I demand this, I demand that, because it was a Franglish. Je demande in French is I ask. And they were asking, but actually they were demanding. Right, and it created a whole cultural issue and dynamic between the French teams and the English teams.
Right, yeah. So that's a great example. So what happens often, language, is what creates culture, and it always has done. Every tribe, every company, every country, or whatever, has a language that encodes the words that are valuable and gives them a definition, and you basically fix a lot of meaning into these few words that can really deliver a certain impact, right? I like to joke, that to my French friends, I'll say, well, in Britain we don't have word for bon appetit, right? We have to use the French one. That says something about British cooking, right? We don't have a word for restaurant. We have to import the French one. It shows something about, and that always gets
cheap.
Yeah, so I always get, always makes me friends in France is to criticize, English. So creating this language is super important, and actually often it's the reason that leadership development often doesn't work. It's because you take the leaders out of their context, you take them on an away day, you give them all some exciting training about how to manage their teams, you put them back into their culture, nothing else has changed in that environment, and so they've got an exciting binder, but there isn't a new conversation happening in the team.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for one person to have a conversation in that context, right? It just fades away. So the conversation just brings you back to the culture, back to normal.
There's a classic there's a classic complaint about, whenever the leadership team go away for their annual conference and then they come back with all these exciting ideas and new things, which most of them die because the rest of the organization has no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Hasn't had all this training about why all this stuff is so important, and really.
And they haven't had the guru for 2 days. They've got their manager for about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And start of a team meeting, right? And that's why. So that's again at the heart of what I've been really focusing on is how do you make things simple and sticky, so you can transmit these ideas with simple words that you can clearly define and help managers communicate into their organization to create a common culture. Because you talk about company culture, but underneath that there is a leadership culture, which is a CEO you need to develop, because you really want all your managers in the company using world-class management techniques and leadership approaches. But how do you spread that learning? How do you accelerate the learning of your whole managers in a consistent way? Well, I think it's through language. Well, I know it's through language. I've seen it work, right? When you actually give people language and simple frameworks in their mind, we're wired for that. We can naturally absorb words and language and meaning. And once we give people that, then you can create a consistency so that that every manager has the same way of looking at a certain topic. I'll give you a very different example. When I was in consulting, it was 2001. There'd just been the .com crash. I was in telecoms at the time, telecoms focused industry, and sales were difficult. And so the CEO sent everybody on, I think it's Miller Hyman, it's quite famous, well-known company, right, doing sales training. And they had a whole process. It took us a day. That changed our sales culture overnight and drove performance really, really fast. Now, I met up with a couple of colleagues 20 years later, and we all remembered that training. It's not many trainings you can say that about. But I'll tell you what, it wasn't about, they've written a book and there's all this extra stuff and the whole process and all the ins and outs and competitive analysis. It wasn't about any of that was the game changer. The game changer was simply that they had given us a language to talk about opportunities in a structured way. So it was around, if you're doing a complex sale, who is your economic buyer, right? Who writes the check? Who is your user buyer who's actually going to have to put up with whatever you do? Who's the technical buyer? Who, HR, procurement, whatever, who they can say no, they can't say yes. And who's your coach? Somebody who really wants you to succeed, who's in the organization. And it's super simple. That stuck with me 20, 30 years later and has changed the way I think about selling, right? All the other, all the checklists and all the processes and they had a sheet you filled in for each account. I don't do any of that. But that language shaped the way I thought, and it shaped my colleagues, and we have that common culture even now.
Yeah, well, I find it funny because I think I've done the same sales training, and again, I don't use any of the spreadsheets and all the forms that we're supposed to fill out, but the concepts around, find your sponsor, find your champion, all that, I do use it. I use it all the time.
Right.
But that's the stuff, the sort of the key words, the key language is what stuck. All the mechanics didn't really. The mechanics actually come from sort of the understanding of the concepts of the words that we used.
Yes.
But it's true. It's the same. You all do this training, and then they reinforce the training, and the rollout is important, and it can shift organization. And I saw it happen. I saw it happen at Sprinkler, where we did a massive growth mindset sort of rollout. And there, what was extraordinary, it wasn't just the leadership team who got training. They took the time to make sure that the training got delivered at different levels. It wasn't just the leaders just regurgitating what they vaguely remembered from the leadership training. There was a systematic rollout, and that's really hard to do. But boy, is it effective if you can. It's an
example of like doing a few things and really nailing them. And so that's one thing I I find works really well. I'll start work with an executive, with their team perhaps, and then it's like, okay, you're starting to learn this language, right? I've been seeding in these discussions, this language. Imagine if everyone in your organization had that language to work with. So often organizations are quite good at coming up with strategic language, like for some of their strategic priorities and things like that, and they encode that sometimes quite well, but often they don't really have that management language, right? That how do we deal with people? How do we set goals? How do we do this? How do we have all of that in a simple way that people can absorb and start to speak and use it with each other? Because actually it starts to propagate by itself once you can get it to that level. Yeah. So language creates culture is the second part. And so these are almost like these two things about language, I think, are really key for creating this kind of like underlying infrastructure, right, for spreading learning across an organization, because learning is communicated through words fundamentally, and simpler the better.
Yeah, I guess it's about making sure when we're using words, we're talking about the same things, and to your point right at the beginning, words create our worlds. That if there is a common language, that language is going to encourage and accelerate a certain level of behavior or attention.
Exactly.
This is just a quick interlude before we get back to today's main conversation. To celebrate the launch of the podcast, we're giving away, for the first time ever, a coaching package valued at over $3,000. You can use it yourself, or you can give it to a friend or colleague who wants to multiply their impact. To enter, all you have to do is leave a review of the podcast on iTunes or in your preferred podcast app, and send a screenshot to podcast@xquadrant.com. And do that before 15th of September 2020. If you do miss that deadline, then leave a review before the 15th of October and there'll be a chance to win a smaller coaching package. For all the details, head to xquadrant.com/podcasts. Reviews are the lifeblood of any podcast, and so whether or not you're within the eligibility time, it would still be fantastic if you would leave us a review if you like the podcast, or if you see the potential in the future as we continue to refine it, develop it and add to it. Many thanks, and let's get back to that conversation.
So now let's talk about how we actually what can we actually do? I mean, there's loads of things about how you actually embed a language. We won't do that on this episode, but here are kind of two things that you can start to think about. The first one is, for accelerating learning, is ask high value questions. Ask high value questions. It's because learning really, the ahas come when you question an assumption. The world looks one way, and then something new comes in. So you can learn. Obviously, you can learn learn a new fact. You can learn that there's a new competitor, or you can learn that there's a new regulation, right? And that's important, to do. But I think the game changers tend to be, that thing we believed. Perhaps it's not quite perhaps it's not quite the way things work.
I guess just trying to understand sort of what you mean by high value questions or questioning assumption. Yeah. It's hard to figure out where you have an assumption. And the closest I can think of is whenever working with customers, probably one of the first things I would do is just make sure I absolutely understood what they were talking about. So I'd ask them to describe their business, and then I'd say, so when you say this, is this what just to make sure I understood their vocabulary. And what inevitably happened was that you'd realize that they had different meanings associated. We each had different meanings associated with the same phrases, and so you ended up creating glossaries, and just trying to make sure we understood. I guess so. My question is, how do you translate that into an internal sort of leadership running an organization, accelerate learning context, how do you find the assumptions to challenge? Like what?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is listening in to the words, right? So you're trying to listen in, and when you hear a word which is not, some words will just catch our ear and we'll go, that's an interesting choice. That's a good place to start, because worlds create our world, right? There's something there, there's an assumption there that is happening. Yeah, and the other one is looking at what are the trade-offs that we are assuming are true here. So, if we do this, then we're not going to be able to do this, or if we do this, then there's a huge risk of this. So if there's those kind of things where there's the obvious trade-off that people are saying, I think that's a really interesting one to dive into. And I would use the X Quadrant approach, right? You got two, you put the assumptions not on one axis, either or, but you put them on two axes, both and you say, well, could we do both? How could we double our revenues and all go home at 4 o'clock?
Wonderful.
But why not, right? If you set that as an objective, well, what would have to be true for us to do that? It might have been assumed that you couldn't do both, but suddenly you open up a new possibility.
And I think sometimes it's the way to challenge your assumptions is to listen when people ask you questions and to really think about the answers you're providing. The only parallel I can think of is, I've just recently, it's been 4 years since I came to France, but I think it probably wouldn't have happened because I'd spent 20 years assuming that something would get in the way and it wouldn't happen. And it wasn't until, and I tried it various times, it wasn't until someone challenged me again and said, well, Stephanie, why aren't you doing it? So I thought, oh yeah, sometimes things become routine and you forget to check. And you need people around you. It's why the danger of the yes men on your team as a leader. You need the people who challenge, because
exactly. So these are back to the high value questions. So what if the opposite is true? Is a nice one, right? So when there is an assertion, well, what if the opposite is true? What would that look like? Or how could we test that? Another one is to listen out for is when people use the words always or never.
Yes.
Right? Anything which is always or never. Really? In what situation would that not be the case? So there's definitely an art around asking high value questions, and but I think a lot of this is it's digging in to some of those assumptions that you're trying to pick up on in your team, in your organization. And then I think related to that, the second action point is around building a learning cycle. So I think I talked about this previously, this idea of doing the decide, do, and debrief, right? So you set your strategy, you go ahead or you set your projects, you go and actually execute and not mess around with what you decided you were going to do. And then when you've done them, you stop and review. And often that review cycle doesn't get done because we're always stretching on to the next thing. We're pushing for the next thing, right? Weekly reviews, one-on-ones with managers are often like, yeah, okay, did you get it done last week? Yep, good, right? No, what went wrong with that? Okay. And then, right, let's talk about it next week. If we just slow it down and get curious, it's like, so worked really well with the client so-and-so. What was your biggest insight from the way you handled that discussion? What worked in what you did? How could you have done that even, how could you have had that conversation in half the time? Or you can just ask these questions to encourage a reflection on the actions. So action without reflection, we don't learn. We just keep going faster and faster. And I find, again, with my coaching clients, I had a client, he had a high value conversation, a critical conversation coming up. We coached him around it. And then the day after, happened to have him on the phone again. I said, well, how did it go? And he said, oh, actually, it was really great. This is what happened. And again, I could have just said, great, and let's move on to what we're doing today, which is on a different topic totally. And I just stopped and said, no. So what's your note to self? What's your note to self on that one? What are you going to learn from that next conversation? And just by taking that time to learn and to articulate the learning. You just added a little thing on, you accelerated it, right? You've actually taken the time.
I think it's the point of articulating the learning, cement it in. There's something you can know instinctively that, you had a coaching session, you then had a conversation which went well. If you don't then take that next step of articulating, okay, what's the insight? What did I get from there? It's just another memory trick. It's another reinforcement trick. Yeah. Just to get that learning to really sit and sink in. Otherwise,
it doesn't have to be from a coaching session. It can be anything, right? Like, I mean, I'll be honest. I did a presentation yesterday, and I wasn't that happy with it. I'll be honest. I wasn't that happy with it. It was okay. It wasn't like bad, but I didn't feel it flew. It wasn't great. And so I made a few notes on it today. It's like, what do I need to learn from that? Oh yeah, I didn't do that. I did this, that didn't really work, that approach. I need to change. I'm not so worried about that because I think we should celebrate our rate of learning, right? People say celebrate failure. I wouldn't say celebrate failure. I'd say celebrate learning. So celebrate the learning that comes from failure. So definitely in a team situation, ask people, what hasn't worked and what have they learned from that? So rather than going, we celebrate failure, who's failed, so forth. It's like, fine, it's okay to fail. It's not great. I mean, it's not what we want, but it's okay to fail. But what I'm really excited about is when you've actually learned through that failure. And celebrate that and put the focus on that and actually go first as a leader. If you can say, I screwed up, I did this, and what I've learned from that is I need to do this. Then you create that culture of learning and of self-reflection. Yeah.
And, I think one of the reasons for a learning culture is so important is that, at the difference from, the language of failure and success, it makes people very afraid of failure. And if you never risk failure, you don't create the opportunity to learn. So you're going to have to shifting the focus onto what have I learned rather than what worked and what didn't, but rather, what did I learn? I think is an interesting way to sort of shift that focus a bit onto something which is actually more productive and actually more beneficial for the long term.
Yeah, I think, again, some language that I would use is, performance culture versus learning culture. And I like to do like that because they both sound quite good. Whereas like if you talk about fixed mindset and growth mindset, then it's like, I have a growth mindset, you loser has got a fixed mindset, right? And so I often get, the problem is all these other people, they've got, fixed mindsets. I've got a growth mindset. Yeah, I know I have a fixed mindset about certain things, like my ability to sing, right, is bad and it's never going to get it. That's my fixed mindset, right? I have a fixed mindset about my ability to, do long distance running, right? It's not true, but I don't believe I'm going to be any good at that ever, right? I'm sure if I trained, I could be, right? But we all have this. But what with the performance mindset, that's really saying that what's really important is that performance right now is the most important thing, right? Performance right now. And if you're in a stable, well-defined context, then that might be enough, right? Sometimes. But when things are shifting and you need adaptability, then actually you might want, then your predictor of future success is going to be that learning mindset, because that's what's going to set you up for the future. And I think in this world where we've had COVID and things have changed around, one of my clients runs a sales team and was saying, well, it's hard because we're not delivering on the numbers we thought we were going to deliver on the start of the year. People are feeling a bit demotivated. And so the discussion got around to, well, how can you accelerate their learning, right? How can you create that learning culture? So even if we're not hitting the numbers that we thought, can we track the progress that we're making in adapting to this environment, in learning and getting better, in figuring out new customer needs, right? In actually getting to the right answer, if you like, quicker than our competitors are going to get to, whatever, and to focus on that, because that's something people can control, and it also opens up, when you learn, the future becomes brighter, right? When we learn.
Yeah, and I would say also, everyone likes change that we choose, but change that happens to us is a deeply uncomfortable and can often be quite a painful experience. But looking at it through a learning lens actually makes it easier to manage and easier to sort of move forwards from whatever change it is that happened. Performance, when a random change gets thrown at you, bit more challenging, I would say. Yeah. Learning is the key, I think, to dealing with that change that's thrown at you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's it, really. So on the insight, it's really around this question of language, right? Words create our world, language creates culture. And as leaders, we have responsibility to be very strategic about the language that we are bringing into our company and into our managers. And that's what I love doing. It's what I love helping people with, because I just see the power of that. And then asking high value questions and building that learning cycle where we're not just in action mode all the time, but we actually take the time to pause and to reflect, to close the loop, is really the dynamic of how you're going to accelerate a learning culture.
Fabulous. Wow. Okay. So accelerating that learning, yet another multiplier, which I think is probably going to be a trickier one to execute. I think there's a bit more help needed there, but I really like the concepts your words create your world. I think that really, really sticks. Language creates culture. It's just going to stick in the head. So then,
see what I did there? I used language to get it to stick, right? I mean, what else do we have, right? What else do we have? Actually, a little practical tip actually is saying. We have a saying creates a saying. So if I say, like, if you just say, I don't know, like, if I just said, oh yeah, words create our world or something, and you wouldn't notice it. But if I said, I've got a saying, words create our world, then just by bracketing it, it lodges it as an entity. So I often tell people, if they've got a leadership thing that they want to express, just package it into a saying, and don't just say it, announce it as a saying. I've got to like, so rather than just saying there's no such thing as, like, I know you might say, I'm thinking of an example, all learning is good. You might just say, all learning is good, right? So rather than just saying all learning is good, just say, I've got a saying, all learning is good. And suddenly it will go into your team, especially if you say it a few times.
It's kind of, it's not just you saying it, there is a saying that many people are saying.
Yeah, it's not even borrowing credibility of anybody else. It's just identifying it as an object in this culture. It's just, it's packaging it just into, there is a saying. It wasn't just a sentence I made up. This is an object I'm kind of giving you, a learning point. So, a bonus extra there before we move on.
So talking of moving on,
yeah.
What will we cover next time then?
The next time, it's the really simple one, addressing friction and drama.
Oh, God. That's going to be the exciting one.
That's going to be good. So, yeah, that's because obviously...
always a bit tell.
There's always going to be one. So, that's what we're going to talk about. So, how do we... And this is really around the limitation of collaboration, right? How do we actually get people to collaborate and not actually just create friction and rub up against each other and slow things down? So how do we actually, what does that look like in the 21st century?
Cool, very cool. So I guess, as always, if people are interested in learning more, subscribe to this podcast or head to the YouTube channel or to xquadrant.com, our website, where there will be the show notes. But any final thoughts on this topic before we go? Yeah,
I think accelerating learning, as you said, is a habit to be built. It's not, there's no simple tick box answer, but it is the pinnacle of leadership. I think we move through stages of management and so forth, but actually helping become a leader that can help a team actually become self-learning and self-improving and can learn at a faster rate. If you can actually instill that as a culture, that's incredible.
Mm.
And so it's something worth aiming for, right? Again, in future episodes, we could go into more detail on any of those points and do other things. But I think realizing that your job is not just to manage a team or to motivate the team. It's not just to fill in the gaps that the team aren't doing by themselves. It's not, it's beyond that. It's actually to accelerate the whole learning of the team and to hopefully make that self-replicating, self-learning, and to multiply other leaders, help other leaders learn. So I think it really is a high calling. And then to do that, it's about slowing down to speed up, right? That's the hard thing. We love the task focused, right? We love just driving and going fast and getting things done. But this does require counterintuitive pausing a little bit and slowing it down to get the insight, which is a challenge, but so worth doing.
Definitely something to aspire to. Thank you, Richard, for that insight.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. It's always great speaking to you. And well, hopefully we'll, in a few days' time, we'll be on again doing that simple topic of friction and drama. So look forward to that.
I'm looking forward to it very much.
Okay, Stephanie, take care. Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Now let's talk about you. When you're in a position of top leadership, when you're in the biggest role of your career, who supports you at a deep level as you lead others? Who helps you multiply your impact and get to the next level? Well, this is what we do. If you'd like to know more about our community of extraordinary leaders, visit us at xquadrant.com.